In the year 79, a volcano buried an entire Roman library under 60 feet of ash, sealing hundreds of scrolls inside blocks of what looked like solid charcoal. For nearly 2,000 years, every attempt to open them destroyed them. Then, without unrolling a single one, artificial intelligence read one from beginning to end. What it found had been sitting 3 feet away from human hands the entire time, completely unreadable for 2 millennia. This is the story of the Herculaneum scrolls, and the only surviving library from the classical ancient world, and the strange decades-long fight to read them without touching them at all. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it didn't just bury Pompeii. A short distance away, in the smaller coastal town of Herculaneum, a massive private villa, believed to have belonged to the father-in-law of Julius Caesar, was buried under superheated volcanic material, reaching temperatures above 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside that villa sat a library, somewhere between 600 and 1,800 papyrus scrolls, carbonized instantly by the heat, turned into something that looks, to the untrained eye, exactly like a piece of burnt firewood. For centuries, those scrolls sat exactly like that, unread, because there was no way to open one without it crumbling into ash. This is the story of how that finally changed, not through some careful new physical technique, but through machine learning, applied to X-ray scans, reading words that had not been seen by human eyes since the reign of the Roman emperors. Let's start with why these scrolls even survived at all, because the same event that seems to have destroyed them is actually the reason they still exist. The Villa of the Papiri, as it's now known, was discovered by accident in the 1750s, when workers digging a well in the area struck ancient stone. Excavations that followed revealed an enormous Roman estate, and inside it, a library, the only large-scale collection of scrolls known to have survived from classical antiquity anywhere in the world. Nearly every other ancient library, including the famously lost Library of Alexandria, is gone entirely, destroyed by fire, war, or simple decay over the centuries. Herculaneum's library survived precisely because it was buried, sealed away from oxygen, moisture, and the passage of time by the very disaster that seemed to have destroyed it. The scale and luxury of the villa itself tells us something important about whose library this actually was. Excavators found an estate, spanning multiple terraced levels, decorated with dozens of bronze and marble statues, elaborate garden peristyles, and mosaic floors, the kind of estate that could only have belonged to someone extremely wealthy and well-connected within Roman society. Historical evidence, including the specific philosophical focus of the texts recovered so far, has led many scholars to associate the villa with Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus, a prominent Roman senator and patron of the arts, who also happened to be the father-in-law of Julius Caesar. If that identification holds up, and it remains a topic of genuine scholarly discussion rather than settled fact, it would mean this library once belonged to a man sitting at the very center of the political world that would soon produce the Roman Empire, collecting Epicurean philosophical texts in his private study while the Roman Republic was quietly transforming into something else entirely around him. But survival came at a brutal cost. In the 18th century, a Vatican conservator named Antonio Piaggio spent years developing a delicate mechanical unrolling device specifically for this material, and using it, painstakingly unrolled a handful of scrolls over the course of decades, one agonizing centimeter at a time. Some of these early unrolled scrolls did reveal actual readable text, written in ancient Greek, giving scholars their very first genuine window into the library's contents. But most scrolls simply couldn't survive the process. Later attempts throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, including efforts in 1969 and again in the 1980s, using various chemical treatments, gases, and mechanical methods, destroyed still more scrolls in the attempt to open them, sometimes reducing an entire roll to fragments in the process. By the early 2000s, the situation had reached an uncomfortable equilibrium. A small number of scrolls had been successfully unrolled and read, revealing genuine philosophical texts. Hundreds more remained sealed, and the consensus among conservators had shifted decisively. Physically unrolling them was simply too destructive to justify continuing, given how much material had already been lost or damaged in earlier attempts. The scroll sat, essentially frozen, in museum collections across Naples, England, and France, technically preserved but functionally unreadable for another generation. The person who eventually broke that stalemate wasn't a classicist or an archaeologist. He was a computer science professor. Brent Seals at the University of Kentucky had been working since the early 2000s on a concept he called virtual unwrapping, using X-ray imaging to scan a rolled or folded ancient document in 3 dimensions, then using software to digitally trace the surface of the material through that scan data, effectively unrolling it inside a computer without ever physically touching the original object. In 2015, Seals and his team proved the concept could genuinely work, successfully reading the Engedi scroll, a badly damaged, carbonized scroll discovered decades earlier in the Dead Sea region of Israel, revealing it contained text from the biblical book of Leviticus, all without ever physically opening it. The Engedi success mattered enormously as proof of concept, but it also revealed exactly how much harder the Herculaneum case would be. The Engedi scroll had been carbonized by a fire that destroyed the ancient synagogue where it was stored sometime around the 6th century, and it had sat, folded and fragile, in Israeli archives for decades, with researchers unwilling to risk physically unrolling it. When Seals' team successfully scanned and virtually unrolled it, the achievement made international headlines, since it demonstrated for the first time that a genuinely unreadable, severely damaged ancient scroll could be read using nothing but X-ray data and careful digital reconstruction. It also set expectations that the same basic method might work relatively quickly on the much larger, much more famous collection of scrolls sitting in Herculaneum. Expectations that turned out to be significantly more optimistic than the actual technical reality. That success proved the underlying method was sound, but the Herculaneum scrolls presented a much harder version of the same problem. The Engedi scroll had been written with a metal-based ink, which shows up clearly under X-ray imaging because it's noticeably denser than the surrounding parchment. The Herculaneum scrolls were written using carbon-based ink, essentially soot, suspended in a liquid binder, which is a serious problem for X-ray scanning because carbonized papyrus and carbon ink have nearly identical density. Under an ordinary CT scan, the ink is essentially invisible, indistinguishable from the burnt material it's written on. Seals had proven you could digitally unroll a damaged ancient scroll. He still needed a way to actually see the writing once it was unrolled, and that problem remained unsolved for years. In March 2023, Seals partnered with Silicon Valley entrepreneurs Nat Friedman and Daniel Gross to launch what they called the Vesuvius Challenge, a global open competition inviting programmers, machine learning researchers, and computer vision specialists anywhere in the world to help solve this specific problem, detecting the subtle physical texture changes that carbon ink leaves on papyrus fibers, even when the ink itself is invisible to a standard scan. The team released detailed, high-resolution CT scan data from actual Herculaneum scrolls publicly, along with cash prizes, including a headline $600,000 grand prize for the first team to successfully extract multiple readable passages of text from a previously unopened scroll. The competition drew in an unusual mix of participants, far outside traditional article challenge. Here is worth understanding in a bit more detail, because it explains why this problem sat unsolved for so long, even after a CT scanner works by passing X-rays through an object from many different angles and reconstructing a three-dimensional density map of everything inside it. For most archaeological scanning, this works beautifully, revealing hidden structures, cavities, or objects based on differences in material density. The problem with the Herculaneum scrolls is that carbonization affected both the papyrus itself and the ink sitting on top of it in almost exactly the same way, flattening what would normally be a clear density contrast into something the scanner essentially can't distinguish at all. Human researchers examining the raw scan data directly could see the physical structure of the rolled papyrus sheets clearly enough to trace their layered geometry. But the actual writing remained invisible, hidden inside data that technically contained it but couldn't display it in any way a human eye could interpret directly. This is precisely the kind of pattern recognition problem where machine learning has proven unusually effective in recent years, finding extremely subtle, non-obvious statistical patterns in large datasets that don't correspond to anything a human researcher would think to look for manually. Contestants in the Vesuvius Challenge trained neural networks on small sections of scan data where ink had already been confirmed by other means, teaching the models to recognize the specific, extremely faint textural signature ink leaves on the papyrus surface, then applying those trained models across much larger sections of previously unread scroll data, gradually building confidence in which faint patterns represented genuine letters versus random noise in the material itself. In October 2023, a 21-year-old computer science student named Luke Ferreter, working independently, successfully trained a machine learning model that detected the very first confirmed word from an unopened Herculaneum scroll, the Greek word for purple. It was a small, seemingly modest result. It was also the first time in nearly 2,000 years that anyone had read a word from inside one of these sealed scrolls without physically destroying it in the process. From there, the pace accelerated quickly. By February 2024, Ferreter had teamed up with Youssef Nader, a graduate student in Germany, and Julian Schilliger, a robotics student in Switzerland, combining and refining their separate machine learning approaches into a single, far more capable pipeline. Using this combined system, the team extracted more than 2,000 readable characters across 4 separate columns of continuous text from a single scroll, earning them the Vesuvius Challenge's grand prize. The passage they recovered turned out to be a previously unknown philosophical text, most likely written by Philodemus, an Epicurean philosopher who lived and taught in the region during the 1st century BCE, discussing whether abundant pleasures are genuinely more enjoyable than scarce ones, concluding, in his own words on the subject, that scarcity doesn't automatically make something more pleasurable, using the example of food to illustrate the point. Think about what had just happened. A text written by a specific, historically documented, arguing a specific philosophical position, had been sitting completely unread inside a lump of carbonized material for nearly 2,000 years, through the entire span of the Roman Empire's decline, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the modern era, before finally being read for the first time by a machine learning model trained by a 21-year-old university student and 2 collaborators he'd never physically met before starting this project together. It's worth understanding why Philodemus specifically matters so much to classical scholars, beyond simply being a name attached to a recovered text. Philodemus was a genuine, historically significant Epicurean philosopher, active in the 1st century BCE, whose work survives today almost exclusively through the Herculaneum scrolls themselves, since almost none of his writing was preserved through the ordinary process of being repeatedly copied by scribes across the centuries the way many other classical authors were. Epicurean philosophy, which emphasized the pursuit of modest, sustainable pleasure and freedom from anxiety as the foundation of a good life, was hugely influential in the ancient world, but fell out of favor in later centuries, partly due to later religious and philosophical traditions that mischaracterized Epicureanism as simple hedonism rather than engaging with its actual, more nuanced arguments. Recovering genuine, complete Philodemus texts directly from antiquity rather than through later secondhand summaries or hostile critiques written by philosophical rivals gives modern scholars a genuinely rare, unfiltered window into how Epicurean philosophy actually functioned as a living intellectual tradition, argued and refined by real practitioners, rather than the flattened and often distorted version that survived through later, less sympathetic sources. The work didn't stop there. The Vesuvius challenge continued with the explicit goal of eventually reading entire scrolls from end to end, rather than isolated passages and fragments. That milestone arrived in 2026, when the same core team, now working directly with the Vesuvius Challenge organization, successfully read the complete preserved portion of a scroll cataloged as PHerc, 1667, continuously, from its beginning to its end, rather than in scattered patches. This particular scroll had a rough history even before the eruption sealed it. Earlier physical unrolling attempts in the 19th century and again in 1969 and the 1980s had already destroyed its outer layers before anyone had access to the imaging and AI tools that exist today, meaning only a small core, roughly 8 centimeters tall out of an original height of 19 to 24 centimeters, actually survived to be scanned and read using this new method. What survived turned out to be worth the wait. Analysis of the recovered text identified it as part of an 8-book philosophical treatise on vices, written by the same Epicurean philosopher, Philodemus, of which scholars had previously known the existence of only a single book. Here's what makes this genuinely different from most archaeological breakthroughs, and why it matters beyond just these specific scrolls. More than 600 Herculaneum scrolls remain completely unopened and unread to this day, and the Vesuvius Challenge organizers have been explicit that this isn't a one-time discovery. It's an ongoing active project, openly inviting continued outside participation from anyone capable of contributing improvements to the underlying detection methods. And beyond the scrolls that have already been excavated, archaeologists strongly suspect that additional, still unexcavated sections of the original villa of the Papiri may contain an even larger portion of the library that has never been dug up at all, meaning the total scale of what could eventually be recovered may be significantly larger than the roughly 600 to 1,800 scrolls currently sitting in museum collections. That last point deserves real emphasis because it's easy to read this story as a closed chapter, a single dramatic discovery, and move on. It isn't. The original 1750s excavation only reached one level of the villa of the Papiri before tunneling operations were halted, and archaeologists have long suspected, based on the layout of the structure and historical records describing the villa's original scale, that a second, potentially larger library level may still sit unexcavated, buried under the same volcanic material that preserved everything discovered so far. If that section exists and is eventually excavated, the entire scale of what's currently being read through AI reconstruction could represent only a fraction of what Herculaneum actually preserved. The deeper significance here goes beyond any single philosophical text recovered so far. This is the only large-scale library that survived from the classical ancient world in any form, meaning every scroll successfully read adds directly to an extremely limited body of surviving ancient literature in a field where scholars are normally working with fragments, later copies, and secondhand references rather than original documents preserved from antiquity itself. Full, previously unknown works by known ancient authors, and potentially works by authors we don't yet know existed at all, are sitting inside scrolls that, until extremely recently, could only be read by destroying them. There's also a broader technological story unfolding here, one that extends well beyond classical scholarship. The same combination of high-resolution X-ray imaging and machine learning-based pattern detection that's being used to read these scrolls has genuine potential application to other categories of damaged historical documents worldwide. Badly burned, water-damaged, or otherwise physically inaccessible manuscripts sitting in archives and collections that scholars have long assumed were permanently lost to physical damage. What started as a highly specific solution to one unusual archaeological problem is increasingly being recognized as a more general breakthrough in how damaged historical documents of many kinds might eventually be recovered without ever physically touching them. Now, what's left is an ongoing race, not against time in the traditional sense, since these scrolls have already survived nearly 2,000 years, but against the scale of the remaining challenge itself. Hundreds of scrolls still sealed, possibly an entire undiscovered wing of the same ancient library still buried underground. And a small, still growing community of researchers and volunteer programmers around the world, slowly teaching machines to read words that have been sitting untouched since before the fall of Rome. So we want to ask you directly, if the rest of this library is eventually fully read, do you think it will reshape how we understand ancient philosophy? Or do you think the biggest discoveries are still waiting in the sections of the villa nobody has excavated yet? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one of them. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the kind where the mystery isn't ancient people at all, but what modern technology is only now capable of finally uncovering, make sure you're subscribed, because next time we're heading somewhere just as remarkable. Until then, stay curious and keep questioning the version of history you were handed.